Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Meet Me at the Spot. I'm your host, Holly, and this week I am so delighted to introduce my amazing guest, Shannon. Shannon is a former fundamentalist who became the first openly transgender man ordained to the old Catholic priesthood. Shannon believes in the transformative power of story. He is the co-founder of queertheology.com. His first book, In the Margins, A Transgender Man's Journey with Scripture, is available now. He has 3 books forthcoming. No One Taught Me How to Be a Man, What a Trans Man's Experience Reveals About Masculinity, Come and See, An Invitation to a Radical Encounter with Jesus, and Reading the Bible Through Queer Eyes. I absolutely got so much out of chatting with Shannon and learning so much, and I am really excited to share a conversation with all of you. So I will let Shannon take it away. Welcome, Shannon, to the podcast. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So for the listeners, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you're all about.
So my usual elevator speech is that I am a trans man who grew up a fundamentalist evangelical in rural Pennsylvania, and then became an openly ordained trans man who's ordained to the old Catholic priesthood. So as you can imagine, it's been quite a journey. And so now my work kind of spans a bunch of things. I definitely write about the intersections of religion and trans identity. I write a lot about masculinity and especially what trans men might have to add and teach us in the conversation about masculinity. And then I'm also a playwright and an author. And so I do a lot of work around creativity and owning our own stories and kind of equipping and empowering people to use their own stories in the work for whatever justice causes that they care about.
That's it. No, I'm just kidding. That's awesome. That's so cool. Um, I'm really excited to dive more. I have so many questions that come up just from just as the listeners, the longtime listeners know I don't prep any questions. They just kind of come up and we just have a conversation. But the first question I always like to know is like, what got you interested in the work that you do?
That's a great question. I think some of it I was like born into,
Mhm.
right? Like as someone who grew up in the church and from a very young age, both felt kind of a calling to stay in it, but also looking around saw how many people were excluded, even as we talked about inclusion, right? Like I grew up in a very conservative denomination, and as someone who is presumed female, all sorts of limits to what I was allowed to do in the church. And so, even from a young age, feeling this disconnect of like, I want to be in this space. I want to do good work. I feel like I internally and maybe from the divine am having a calling. And yet I'm being told over and over again that you can't do the work that you feel passionate about. So that growing up with that tension, that's always been really present. And then the more that I started to get involved in storytelling and theater work in particular, I really saw how much telling stories shifted narratives and conversations. And so then as I came out, and so many conversations in as I was coming out were like, is it okay to be gay and Christian? Can you be trans and part of the church? Is it okay to transition? And those conversations were they were very boring and they were very repetitive, and we kept arguing over the same things. And what I realized really quickly was that when I stopped arguing with people and I instead told my story, suddenly the conversation and the tenor of the conversation really shifted. I've walked into rooms where I could tell people did not want me to be there, and I've told my story. And at the end, they still maybe didn't want me to be there, but the conversation wasn't like, oh, let's talk about those Bible passages again. It was, oh, like tell me more about your faith, right? And just that shift became something that I saw that there was real power in that. And so then I wanted to in addition to continuing to tell my own story and to tell other stories, to really help people tell their stories better. And by that I mean like to feel more confident in like I can own my story and I can show up in a space and I can tell it in a way that feels good to me, that isn't re-traumatizing or that isn't me saying things that I didn't want in the hands of hostile people, because I believe that stories can really shift how we do justice work and how movements are built, and shifted. And so that's kind of like both a how I got interested in this work, but like why I've stayed in it so long.
When I came across your story, and I know just very small snippets of who you are, but I was super fascinated because a lot of guests that come on the show often talk about how they grew up um, religious in some way, very much in the church, went to Catholic school, all of this stuff. And that not learning about like sexual health education made a lot of them become part of sex education, sex educators, and things like that. So it's always fascinating because most of my guests are like, yeah, I left the church when I became an adult, and I'm not
Yeah.
part of that anymore. And so your story really resonated because it was like, oh, this is a different perspective, right? Like this is a totally different perspective than the guests that I usually have on, which I think is it's awesome. I'm not gonna lie to you. That's really cool.
Yeah, and I will say that like, I know that the church has done so much harm, especially when it comes to our bodies and to sexuality, for people of all genders, right? And a lot of the work that I do is walking with particularly queer and trans folks who are trying to figure out like, do I want to stay in the church or do I want to go? Like, can I heal this harm? Or can I not? And I will say that a large portion of my work is like helping people to leave well, right? Like if you are coming to us and you're saying like I the only reason I'm still in the church is because I'm afraid of going to hell. It's like, okay, like let's help you get unafraid and then you can decide, does this still resonate with me or is there something else? I think for me, like my faith looks obviously drastically different than it did how as I was growing up. But back to the story thing, there was something so captivating for me in this Jesus story, right? A story about justice, about someone who was always centering those on the margins, who was trying to build a movement that was equitable and fair and based in justice, and that was not just religious, but that was also like political and was always breaking boundaries and binaries. And there's something very queer in the Jesus story for me.
Yes.
And so like I want to keep embracing that story and also saying to folks that like if you want to stay in the church, there's a place for you. Like you might have to create your own space. You might have to do some work to like be in it healthily, but if you want to stay, you absolutely can. And so it's kind of that always, again, holding that tension of if you want to leave, let's help you leave well. But if you want to stay, there's a place for you in the midst of this.
I think a lot of people, especially people who have really not been involved in any kind of like organized religion, or haven't for a long time, forget that Jesus was a social justice like
Yeah.
warrior, man. Like if
Yeah.
you really like take time to read and understand, like Jesus would have been very much hated by the people who claim that they love
Oh,
Jesus.
yes. Yes.
I
Absolutely.
I'm like, oh, you guys would have hated Jesus. Like, you would have been very much on the side of watching him get crucified. I love that perspective that you bring, and like church can be for everybody. And I think that's a message that gets lost, especially with like young people, because we
Yeah.
see this messaging around what's a lot of people think religion should look like. I never saw religion that way growing up, but my dad, when we would go to church and everything, he would tell us like the Bible is not meant to be taken like literally word for word, right? But instead, we should be taking like the messaging and the overall themes that are coming out, and how do we apply that to the way we live our lives. So for me, that's how I've always approached church. So I've never had like a I hate the church. Even I don't go to church anymore. If there's a wedding in a church, like of course. I've been recently enough to know the changes. It's always fun going to a wedding at a Catholic church when people haven't been in a long time because I'm like, oh no, we don't say that. We have not done that in years, my friend.
Right.
So it's been like over a decade. I really like that messaging that you bring. Like, if church is something like you that feels really important to you and part of your life and you want it to be, but you're kind of wrestling with that. There's a place for you in the church.
Yeah.
I think that's wholesome. More people need to hear that. So I think a lot of people struggle like, oh, because I've been told like I'm gay, I'm trans, I'm, questioning my identity, questioning my sexuality. That means there isn't a place for me in the church.
Yeah. And there might not be a place for you in all churches. So I just want
Mhm.
to say that too. Like you got to do your homework, you got to do your
Yes.
research. And I think that that's why it's so hard often for younger folks, right? Who maybe don't have their own car or don't
Hmm.
have agency over what kind of church they're being brought to or told that they have to go to. And that's just really difficult, right? And especially if you're not getting this support from your family or your family isn't plugged in enough to help you think through like the thing that your dad said, it was right, so beautiful and so important.
Hmm.
If you're not getting that message from your parents, that can be really, really hard.
I like that you said that. Not every church is going to be the church for you. I always think of it like therapy. Like when I have friends that have never been to therapy and they're like, "What? I don't know. I'm nervous." It's like, all right, the first thing I'm going to tell you is my piece of advice is I will guarantee that the first therapist you meet with is probably not going to be the therapist you stick with. It just is like a thing for everybody. And I think that can be really kind of related to church too, right? Like
Yeah,
the church
yeah,
you first go to may not be the right one for you, but there's lots of different kinds of churches
yeah,
that are out there. I grew up Catholic and I only knew about Catholic churches. So I didn't really know a lot about like other denominations and like a First Unitarian type church. Like they're so cool. Um, they're like the coolest people. I was like, wow, this is a church. Wait, your pastor is lesbian. What? What's happening here? That's so cool. But yeah, so obviously growing up in rural Pennsylvania, you said?
yes, yeah,
Yeah, how fun of a
yeah.
time. Kind of what was going through that? And I know, you're in the Midwest now, which, has some things there too, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the hardest part of growing up in rural Pennsylvania, well, first of all, I am old, right? So grew up before the interwebs were a thing, and like we didn't
Yes.
have cable television. We had three channels or four if you held the rabbit ears just right.
Yes.
Um, and I also was homeschooled for from seventh through 12th grade. So, I was really isolated. And I
Mhm.
think that that had a deep impact of like the church became my entire world, right?
Mhm.
That was like kind of my quote unquote class, right? I went to youth group. Those were the people that I was socializing with. Um, but and in some ways I think that that was really beautiful. I was a really weird kid. I'm not sure that I would have done very well in a public high school. Like I probably would have gotten bullied,
Mhm.
and I got to avoid all of that. But at the same time, I think growing up in that kind of closed environment also meant that I grew up without any kind of language about gender or sexuality, right? The sex talks that we got were don't do it
Mhm.
ever. Um, and no one was talking about gender. Not really. It's weird, right?
Mhm.
They were talking about gender all the time, but they weren't talking about gender. And so there was
Yes.
all of this conversation about like gender expectations,
Mhm.
but like we're never talking about gender. And so I'm a kid that I have looked like a 12-year-old boy since I was 11. And so there was this tension all the time around how I was dressing, what I,
Mhm.
wore a baseball cap all the time. The adults in my world hated that. I
Mhm.
never wanted to wear a skirt. And so I grew up feeling like I was doing something wrong, but
Mm,
but again, no one had language and no one was talking about it. So it just became this like vague sense of something is wrong with you, right?
mm,
Whether it's like something is wrong with your body, something is wrong with your presentation, it was just like something is wrong. And so I
mm,
really grew up with that tension. And then also in my own self, like had a lot of dysphoria, but didn't have any language to
mm.
talk about that. And I remember like I was 17, 16 or 17 when Ellen DeGeneres came out. And that, of course, like a huge thing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I had remembered feeling like my family watched her television show. I really liked Ellen, and I was like, oh, she dresses kind of masculine. Like I probably would have said, like she wears boys' clothes and she's
Yeah.
single. So I really felt drawn to that. And then she came out and I was like, oh shit, like what does that say about me? And I had this sense of like, oh, this is. I hope that people don't see in me what they see in her, and but like now I feel really awkward about it. Um,
Mm,
and so what is I think the biggest thing was just this lack of language and this lack of words to be able to describe myself and my experience, and that left me with this vague sense of unease for much longer, right? I don't know, like I still probably would have had a lot of tension around sexuality and gender had I been able to name it, but I think being able to name it would have done something.
mm.
And it was definitely a relief when like I found words much later in life. And I think that yeah, that's why I'm like so grateful that there's such that people have access to the internet now, that people have access to language. And anytime I do workshops around like trans stuff and people get, you know, in their feelings about how many terms there are, I'm like,
Yeah.
yes, but the reason that we have all these terms is because we can. And we like, so many of us have lived for so long without being able to name our identities that like, just let them have the words. It's gonna be fine. You're gonna be
Yeah.
fine. Like you don't have to remember them all, but like we're gonna be okay. And it matters that people are able to name their experiences and their identities.
Yeah. No, oh my gosh, I say the same thing, in working in the spaces that I do, a lot of times people are like, oh, there's so many. I can't remember them all. It's like you don't have to. Nobody expects you to be a walking, talking, dictionary or thesaurus or whatever for all LGBTQ plus terms. I I work in this field. I've worked in sexual health for 17 years. I'm a queer woman myself. I don't know all of them. I'm always learning something new. So don't worry. I'm not going to quiz you on the terms, but I agree. Like, yes, there's so many terms because so many people feel like they need that sense of community, that sense of belonging, that term. And I've talked about this on this podcast before, but um, I watched in real time during a group activity during a training. This beautiful human being we were going through. We had to do like, here's the term, here's the definition, match them together, and we were going through them. And this person like had this epiphany, like the light bulbs went off, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, I never knew there was a term for what I
Hmm.
am. I'm demisexual. I never knew that there was a term that existed. I never knew there were other people that felt this way." And so that was just like, will be a moment I remember for the rest of my life. And it was one of like the coolest moments to watch in real time. Um, and I think a lot of people don't recognize that like growing up in, 80s, 90s, we didn't have a lot of representation on TV at all,
Yeah,
like
no,
of LGBTQ plus people. And a lot of people don't know that when Ellen came out on that show, they canceled it. They
yeah,
canceled the show. It was, I mean, it was like a triumphant moment for so many people. Like, holy cow, what an iconic moment. And then for her show to get canceled, it was like, just kidding. I'm not. Nope.
yeah, yeah,
Need to come out. Nope. I'm just gonna go ahead and just not, because if someone like as big as Ellen, I mean, and she was big even before like her talk show. She
oh
was
yeah,
she was a
yeah,
big deal, um, and stuff like that. And for her to get just the show canceled, not even like we're taking, we're moving you in a different role. We're doing this. No, done, canceled.
yeah,
But I think we've just come such a far, far way.
I think we always have a long way to go, but holy cow, like we've really come a long way.
It's like so vital that younger folks and older folks too, like know our history. Like
Yeah.
I will sometimes see young folks on social media who are like frustrated about representation. And listen, there is still, like you said, there is still a long way to go on representation.
Hmm.
Um, but like they not understanding, like when we were growing up, the idea that one day people of the same gender could get married,
Yeah.
like that wasn't even a blip of a hope of a dream, right? That was just like never going to happen.
Right.
And so to know how quickly things have changed, I think is just so important. And especially it's important as we're in whatever political moment we're in right now, where we just don't know, right?
Hmm.
It is to remember that like we have always existed. Our community has always been here. I don't know what the next however many years is going to hold. I don't, I'm not going to say like everyone's going to survive. Like we know that might not be true. And also like we have always showed up for each other and we've been community and we continue to push and to fight and things have gotten better and they've gotten better very rapidly. Which
Hmm.
is, I think, frankly, why we are in a political moment that we're in now. Like we are seeing the pushback to that rapid expansion of rights and a rise in visibility. And you know, that's a whole nother that's maybe a whole nother podcast and conversation. But I do think it's really important for like for folks to know our history and to know what we've come from and through and not and this is not to say like, oh, you don't know how good you have it. It was really
Hmm.
bad, but to say that like this is what we've walked through and in very recent history, right?
Hmm.
I just think that that's so important. And because then we can also look at like how did people organize before we had social media? How were people organizing when, you know, bills were being passed before? How did we get to the point where same gender marriage happened so quickly?
Hmm.
Like there are lessons to be learned from that can feed and inform the work that still needs to be done and that we're doing now.
Yeah, for sure. I love that part about the history. I think that that is so important. Because yes, trans folks, LGBTQ plus folks in general have always existed, always. Um, Not just because now all of a sudden, we have LGBTQ plus folks on TV and representation. I think it's so important, like you said, like how did we organize? How did we work to get legislation through? And especially now, with all of these attacks on social media platforms and, the time we're recording this to the time this comes out, there may not even be a TikTok anymore. Um,
Hmm.
which is such a huge organizing platform for so many people. We didn't have TikTok back when Trump was first elected. It wasn't really a thing in 2016. It became, big obviously during the pandemic, but um, and we fought, and we're still going to fight, and we're going to continue to
Hmm.
fight, and it's going to be hard, and there's a lot of unknowns, and it's going to suck. I don't like to sugarcoat things for people either. I'm like, I'd like to sit here and be like, it's going to be okay, but it's, for a lot of people, it's not. And
Yeah.
so we have to be realistic, but that piece about community that you said, I think is huge. It's the reason why I started a podcast. It's the reason why I started doing interviews, and I will never record a podcast all by myself ever again. I love to have guests on because at the end of the day, we are all we have.
Yeah.
We're what we got, and we've got each other. And I like to hear different voices, and I like to have different perspectives on the show because um, lots of different people tune into the show, and lots of different people are trying to find their community still.
Yeah.
And so I'm always like, I hope I have every guest like inspires or just reaches out to at least one other person. because then I will feel like I have done justice to this podcast. But
as always, part 2 will be out next week, so make sure you tune back here on Wednesday to hear part 2 of my amazing conversation with Shannon. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Meet Me at the Spot. I'm your host, Holly, and this week is part 2 of my amazing conversation with Shannon. If you did not listen to last week's episode, go back, check that one out, and then come back here for part 2.
I am fascinated to know about your books. I'm super, super excited to talk about that.
Yeah. Which one would you like to talk about first?
Yes. Where does it feel most natural for you to start?
Yeah. So my first book came out in 2022, which is called In the Margins: A Transgender Man's Journey with Scripture. And it's in some ways it's a quirky little book, in that it's half memoir, and half retellings of Bible stories from a trans perspective.
Ooh.
So each chapter is kind of a retelling of a story from Scripture with my story woven in and around and through. And it was a really fun book to write. But kind of one of my favorite things of hearing in people's response to the book is like, for them to say, I saw myself in this story too, right? Like, you're telling your story, but I found echoes of things that I had experienced. And obviously, like, I have a really specific story. And so to hear like cis straight folks also be like, yes, I was told weird things about my body. It's like, yeah, like this is the joy of sharing our stories, when we find out like how not alone we are, even in the things that we thought were very particular to our own lives. And so that was the first book that came out. And then I have a book coming out in April called No One Taught Me How to Be a Man: What a Trans Man's Experience Reveals About Masculinity. And it's a book, again, that is partly memoir. It's me kind of telling stories about when I transitioned, trying to figure out, and even before I transitioned, trying to figure out like, what does it mean to be a man? Um, and as a white person living in the United States, masculinity and whiteness and religion, like all of those things are deeply intertwined and very complicated. And so like as you try to think and pull all of those things apart and be like, okay, well, like I have this sense that I am a man, but like what does that even mean? And how am I going to embody that in the world? And I think the real gift of transness is that like you don't just stumble into something. I guess you could, but like it feels like because you're making the decision to like pursue wholeness through transition, it kind of leaves everything on the table, right? And so you can start to say like, okay, well, that means like I get to choose like what my masculinity is going to look like. I get to choose how I'm going to embody that. I'm going to choose like how that means that I show up with people of other genders. And so the book is both like my journey of figuring out like what that looked like, and part of that was like looking at a bunch of different examples of masculinity and kind of how messed up they are, and like like from books and pop culture and all of those things. But then it's an invitation, particularly to cis men, to consider like how they want their masculinity to look and feel. And so some of them are like, here are some things you might need to unlearn, and some things that I needed to unlearn in order to like show up well with people of other genders. Here are some things that like we're seeing in studies and science that men are like really screwing up and that are not good for us. And when they're not good for us, we turn out to not so good for other people. And so like, here are some ways that we might be able to unpack that. So I hope that it's a helpful book. It feels like a fraught time to be releasing a book about masculinity into the world. And also it feels like this is the time that we desperately need to be having these conversations. And I think that there are a lot of folks that are really hungry for these conversations, but like don't know quite how to enter into them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm a mom of a daughter. So and my spouse and I always talked about like being nervous about having, if we were going to have a boy, especially, growing up in America as white people as well. How do we kind of shield, protect, educate, all of these things, our young boys around like toxic masculinity, white supremacy, the things that they're very susceptible to kind of becoming a part of this, the messaging that young boys receive, especially young white boys receive in this country. So I think this book is coming out at such a great time. When people are really wanting, I think a lot of people are wanting to have these conversations, but maybe don't know where, kind of where to start.
Yeah, and one of the things that I was really like, I've read a lot of books about men in order to write this book. And one of the things that I was really struck by is that even the books that are really, I would say, like, feel progressive or feel like they are from progressive folks that are trying to, undo some of these assumptions or expectations. Almost all of them, well, they're all written by cis folks. And so all of them have this weird stuff in them that I'm like, you were like doing so well, and then all of a sudden it was like a wheel fell off. And it all came back to this really like gendered expectations, a kind of binary essentialism or like gender essentialism that even was creeping up in I think really progressive spaces. And so I think it's so hard. Again, this is one of the gifts I think of being trans, is like it's so hard to see the water you swim in. And I think trans folks, because of how we were raised, like we can just see the water. And so like to have conversations that are led by trans folks who can kind of point to these things and be like, yeah, but you started out really well, but then you said all of this weird stuff. Like maybe that's something that we need to unpack. So I think that work is so hard. It's so hard to do, and it's so important for all of us. And I think that when we talk about gender, we're often trapped in really binary thinking, and especially when we talk about masculinity, we're trapped into really, really binary thinking about good and bad and right and wrong and like what's toxic and what's not. And so really starting to like pull at these threads and unpack all of it gets really complicated. But I think that's like we have to do that work if we're going to get to being able to like lay out a blueprint of like this is what it looks like to be healthy, and this is what it looks like to show up healthy for yourself and for others.
Yeah, I love that. And a lot of the messaging that I think boys, men, especially cisgender folks receive is very very binary. Like you said, it's like you need to be tough. If you're not tough, then we're going to call you all sorts of derogatory feminine type names. And this is the way you need to show up to be a quote unquote real man, toughen up and all of this stuff. And we do a huge disservice to young men when we kind of bring them up in that sort of messaging. Big time.
But I've also seen the flip side, right? Of women who are on social media saying, I don't want men to be toxic, but like, I don't want to see them cry. And it's like, okay, well, we can't do that. Like you are contributing to the space that is telling men that they can't be vulnerable, right? And so like again, really having to wrestle, and I want to be very clear. I do not think it is women's job to fix men. Like that is not what I'm saying. And also I want to say, like, as we walk through together of like what it will take for men to show up in healthier ways, like there are real systemic and societal issues that are contributing to why men sometimes feel like they can't show up and be vulnerable. And 98% of that is other men, right?
Mhm.
But there is, I think, a percentage of like we have conditioned ourselves as a culture, where like some women feel uncomfortable seeing men be vulnerable or cry, and I think that like we have to talk about all of that if we're gonna really, again, like untangle all of this mess.
Oh, for sure. 100%. I see like that narrative a lot too. It's like because as as cis women, a lot of times we've been conditioned to be like, this is what a man is supposed to be. This is what a man's supposed to do. And there's that internal struggle too of like, I want to have a man in my life, for example, who shows up in these ways that I was taught, but also not be that person either, but
Right,
also have
right.
some of these qualities, but not too much of these qualities, because then that's like a lot, you know? And so I think there's like, because just in our society, like we're just stuck in these binaries. It's this or it's that. You behave this way or you behave that way. And we just kind of leave out all this middle ground. Um, we set expectations for ourselves and for each other that are sometimes just unrealistic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're setting yourself up and you're setting future partners or friends or family. You're setting them up for failure, but you're setting yourself up for failure, about how that relationship could look,
Yeah.
and should look. Yeah, wow. You have my head like just going like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
what? I never thought about this way before. Yeah. Holy cow. Well, that's so cool. Um, that you're bringing that up. It's not cool that, yeah, that we live in a, that's not the cool part. I'm interested to know, I'm going to ask you kind of just like a silly question maybe, but in preparation for writing your books, have there been things that have come up that you're like, what the heck is this? Like this is like wild moments, anything like that has kind of come up for you, or even in thinking about like conversations you have with folks and telling your story, like
Hmm.
are there any like just wild stories?
It's a great question. You know, I so this is like in the telling my story. One of the things that I am continually fascinated by and frustrated by is that it is often the folks that think that they're the most progressive when it comes to trans issues that are the ones that I'm like, please stop talking to me.
Mhm.
Um, you are being weird and creepy, and this conversation does not feel good. And that happens to me. It happens to me a lot in church spaces. Folks who like really and because they like have done some work and they are probably better than other folks in the same space, they like really think that they've arrived. And that is just frustrating and that's hard. It because you feel like you're grateful for the work that they've done, and also there's like so much more work to do, and so
Yeah.
like that is always I think a push for all of us in whatever justice work we're doing is like you don't ever arrive. So keep
Yes.
learning, keep growing, keep shifting, and keep changing. um so that's one thing. I think with this masculinity book, one of the hardest pieces was like feeling like I needed to deal with Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson
Mm.
and really not wanting to.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like I was like, I don't want to read Jordan Peterson's book. I don't want to learn about like what Andrew Tate is teaching young boys, but feeling like I had to. And so
Mm-hmm.
I did. I read Jordan Peterson. Um, he is not a good writer. Uh, I would just
Sorry.
say that.
No, I love that.
And dove into some of Andrew Tate stuff, and then I also read a couple of. There's a very famous book in kind of evangelical Christianity called Wild at Heart by John Eldridge, which has sold like a bajillion million copies, has a 20th anniversary edition, which is all about masculinity. So read that. And then also read Owen Strachan's War on Men. He's someone writing about masculinity from a religious perspective. And like, it's just trippy, some of these ideas. I think it's easier it's easier in some cases when you're reading someone like Owen Strachan, who's just like very clearly doing a certain thing, right? And it's very obvious what that thing is that he's doing. So you can kind of be like, okay, well, I'm not going there with you because like I fundamentally disagree with what you're trying to do. But Eldridge is, I think, really complicated, right? Because he's someone who accurately diagnoses the problem for a lot of men, which is like, the world is changing and we don't know how to change with it. No one is giving us a blueprint. Many men are feeling like bored in their lives. We don't know like how to show up in our families because no one has taught us how to do that. And so he like accurately diagnoses all of the things. And I'm like, yes. And then he's like, and so what you need to do is like get a ceremonial sword and go outside more. And it's like,
wait, what?
So the evangelical church is like really obsessed with the movie Braveheart.
Oh yeah, sure.
And so ceremonial swords.
Yeah.
Like Braveheart. Right. And it's like, you were so close. And so like kind of grappling with some of those, like writing takes you down places that you're like, oh, I don't know that I wanted to know that this is out there. And also I do think it's helpful, right? Because I think that there's so many messages about like what evangelicals believe or how they're thinking or whatever, and it's helpful sometimes to like read these texts and be like, okay, now I understand, like this is the argument that they're making.
Yeah.
And like Owen Strachan is just like, he blames feminists and gay people for every ill of the world, right? And so you're like, okay, sure.
Yeah, as a queer feminist, I'll take all the credit for messing it all up.
You've destroyed everything. But like someone like Eldridge is doing something very different, which I think is actually in some ways more dangerous, right? Because it's not as easily dismissible. And I think that's tricky and that's hard, and that's why we have to pay attention to all of the messages that are coming out.
I think one of the things that you said that really struck me too was there are so many people that think learning about people who are different than you is like a destination, right? That like you need to work to know all about that and then your work is done. And it's like if you're not a forever student in, cultures and identities that are different than yours, then you're doing a huge disservice to yourself. But as much as we talk about like how amazing it is to have all these terminology around LGBTQ plus folks, that language is always changing, always evolving. And that's like one of the other beautiful things about it, right? Is that language is always changing. I used to do a lot of presentations and a lot of trainings around LGBTQ plus topics. And I'm like, we're doing this training today. This training in 2 years could be very different, right?
Yeah.
Because things have changed. And that's a beautiful thing, like that it is evolving and that it is changing. But that means that people need to always be a student, especially in topics and parts of people's identity that they're not personally a part of, and learning all of those, just kind of learning, just being a forever student. That's always my goal. Like I just want to be a forever student. I just want to always be learning, and I'm so fascinated to learn about people who don't look like me, who don't have the same identities that I do, and even people who do have similar identities that to me. Like I'm always learning. Just because we have like XYZ, like identity does not mean we're the same. Like all trans people are not the same, right? Like
Yeah.
all trans people have very, very different experiences. And so I am loving, like, I will just give you some background. Season 3 of this podcast is for trans men. Apparently, I have booked trans men. And I'm super stoked about it because I think it's a perspective that is often not thought of when we think about trans folks, because there's so much, unfortunately, negative attention, especially on trans women, and not as much towards trans men. That's not to say that trans men don't face, obviously, you know, a lot of crap. But I think it's just such a great perspective that we don't often think about, especially like, I work in reproductive justice spaces and I talk a lot about abortion and birth control. And it's something like I'm very, very adamant about not only myself and my organizations that I work with, but other organizations that show up in similar spaces that are going to talk about these issues, that we're not just talking about them as women's issues. Yeah. These are people issues, right? These are human issues. And lots of different folks have to, get abortions or get birth control or need, gynecological care, for example, right? And so get pregnant, right? So like these are things that I think are just amazing for people like you to be on this podcast and to be on the show, for the listeners to hear like these different voices and different perspectives. And like I said, you bring such a unique perspective because you also then come with that like really cool like religion piece to it, which I think is just really, really fascinating. And I'm like so excited to read your book. Like I'm pumped. And I will obviously in the show notes we'll put ways for folks to get access to that, and for your future book that's coming out, which I think is going to be so good. Like no pressure, but I think it's going to be really great.
Well, thank you. I hope so.
Yeah. I hope so. It's so hard always at the end that it's already been like almost an hour. And it goes by so fast. But I always like to ask at the end, are there any kind of topics that you were hoping we would talk about that we didn't get to? And or any parting words for the listeners? Just any kind of advice that you have.
I think we covered everything. My parting words. I want to go back to community, and we were talking about community earlier. I just think it is so, so, so important that you find your people in person. And I know that is often difficult. I get it. Like I live in a rural community. I understand it can be hard to find people that share similar values and are like-minded. But I think it's so vital right now that we know our neighbors, that we have community, that we can be physically with in person, that we have people that we can share meals with, which isn't to say like that you can't have online communities or that online communities aren't real. We all know that they are real. But I really think that like the community that we can form in person right now is going to be the thing that's going to carry us through the next however long. And so like, I just want to encourage folks to really make the effort to reach out to the people that are already organizing in your area, that are already meeting up, whether it's like joining a book club or a dinner club or something else. But like, I think we all really need to find our people, and to know our neighbors and to be in community with humans in person now more than ever. And so I just want to encourage folks to be about that work.
I love that. Yes. Community. I was literally talking about in my daytime job, we were talking about like what's kind of on our mind, how are we feeling, what's kind of going on for us. And I was like, I had just been feeling such a need for community right now, and having this podcast and being able to talk to folks like you, like makes me feel like there's community. And it honestly, when things are really hard, it makes me feel really good to know that like you're not alone in this, right? Like,
yes.
We're in this together. We're going to show up for each other and support one another. I always say on this podcast, I always joke, although it's not a joke. I started this podcast as a way to make friends, so my introverted self could make friends. And so every person I have on my show, they don't know it, whether they like it or not, but we're friends. No, I'm just kidding. I just appreciate all of like the really great perspectives you brought. You really like mind blown for me. I'm like, there's a lot of things I'm like, wow, I never really thought about it from that perspective. So I just really appreciate you for that. And I appreciate you for sharing and for being vulnerable and talking about that. It's really great. And I thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I really have loved this conversation, and it was a really great question, so appreciate it.
Oh, good. And definitely you are more than welcome to come back anytime you want to talk about any of the things, or, we just need to vent. And again, we'll have all the ways to support you in the show notes and things like that. But thank you again so much. I appreciate you.
My pleasure.
Another huge thank you to Shannon for sharing so much wisdom and helping me, and I'm hoping a lot of you see that trans folks and LGBTQ plus folks in general do have a place within faith-based settings. I will put the information and the titles for Shannon's books in the show notes. Make sure that you are supporting Shannon. And again, a huge, huge thank you.